side of caution. But is that realistic for how human beings are?
You know, it's very difficult to say, as Sanjay was saying, what's realistic for how human beings are, because human beings are much more complicated than the remedial measures that legislation puts in to deal with the problems that might occur. I think that in this case, if somebody is saying to you, yeah, you're looking very nice, and you respond positively, obviously there's nothing really wrong with that, unless it becomes a cumulative adding up of something that the person who is being said this to feels upset about. But in order for a corporation, an organization, like Mr. Pai is saying, to actually deal with the problem, you have to draw some very hard lines. And it's only when those lines are drawn and cases are dealt with that people will know that they have to be very careful.
So, Nilanjana, are we then saying here on this program today that a relationship at the workplace between a subordinate and a superior is something that cannot be accommodated under the larger umbrella of that grey area, the sexual chemistry between men and women that can exist?
I think you've got a contradiction in terms. One is that it's going to happen, you know.
Irrespective of all of this, right?
It happens in corporations that have the strictest rules. It's very hard to legislate people's feelings.
It's in the nature of the beast, as it were.
Yeah, but I think, again, what happens is that as the workplace evolves, you do, as somebody who heads a corporation, have to look at the message that you're sending out to other people. And what you might see as a consenting relationship might be interpreted by people under you as a signal that it's all right to just go up to random women and actually harass them. You know, I remember about 15 years ago, the way the media workplaces were. They were extremely sexist organizations, and any women who joined the media about 20 years ago faced a lot of what people might consider not quite harassment. But you didn't want to walk into office to have your clothes and your looks commented on. And I'm very glad that that aspect of it is changing, even if it makes for a more conservative workplace in the long run. Relationships as such, I think if you look at David's case, he's talking about a 2-year, 3-year-long friendship. I find it interesting that Penguin didn't blow the whistle on this friendship until the point of time at which there's trouble. So if you look at this, and not just this case, but other corporate cases, what you're saying is that corporations are effectively saying, all right, we'll look the other way while you do this, but don't get into trouble, because then we're going to have to...
Well, that's what I was saying, that most people do still look the other way. Your organization has actually done some surveys on the attitudes of women at the workplace. And I mean, one of the things I read in that was that many women were actually all right, or felt it was okay to have a relationship at the workplace, even if the man was married.
Yes. You know, surprising, Barkha, when we did run that survey, and the purpose of running those surveys was to come out and highlight some of the changing attitudes at the workplace, a lot of the assumptions that we had gone with before we ran the survey sort of came back to us. You know, so there was an assumption that in the IT industry, you know, dressing is something which is taken as granted, that, you know, you do dress casually, you don't need to be formally dressed. Whereas what we got back from the survey was that no, you know, close to 75 to 80% of the people actually said that it is a good, you know, metric to have, because if there is too much of casual dressing and, you know, there is probably your spaghetti tops and, you know, there's skirts allowed and there's too much of skin showing, so to speak, it does affect performance. You know, so that is something that's interesting, where we are seeing that there is a complete change of mindset in people, even though there has been, you know, a reduction of the age in the workforce today.
But here's the thing, and I need to take a break, and I know I still haven't spoken to some of our panelists, but there is a collision of politics here. And the collision of politics and ideologies is probably this, that on the one hand, there is a meltdown of the conventional relationship as we know it, there is a meltdown of the conventional marriage as we know it, there is a freer sexuality, there is women saying, why can't I wear that damn spaghetti top if I want to, and I don't care what it does to the workplace around me. On the other hand, are we actually pushing, to borrow a phrase from you, for a more conservative workplace? And we're human, so how do we navigate this space? Also, what about the charge? Sanjay Srivastav says it's a red herring, but is it true that women too can peddle sexuality to get ahead? We'll look at that controversial formulation coming up right after this. Welcome back to We the People. We're debating whether sexual harassment as a concept is something that has been understood and internalized by all of us at the workplace. Before I return to our panel, let's get some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Basically, I would believe that the conflict between the sexes arises because there is no clear workable definition of what sexual harassment is. It is defined exactly as the female, in the equation wishes to be. A system which, puts in punitive punishment to the male in a scenario like David's should require a workable definition at the very least, in which, at least the clear parameters are laid down. Not there in many cases, even I think in Infosys not laid down very clearly.
All right, let's park that thought. Is there a workable definition that we can accept? Your question.
What I'd like to say is that even though, in most cases it is assumed that it is the male who's going forth with these things, even if we say that, okay, where a woman misuses this thing is an exceptional case, but there should be some rule to that exception also. What about the poor guy who gets stuck? One odd poor guy, but he does still get stuck.
Okay, that is a thought, and it's a thought for Sanjay to park. You had a question.
The question I wanted to ask was whether there's a larger dynamic in play here. The reason why most of our labor laws do exist, there are definitions in place, but the fact is that they don't get implemented. And we do have clear guidelines laid down in the Vishaka case, and they have been implemented as in the AK Chopra case. But the reason why does it have to be that a woman has to go to the Supreme Court every time to get her justice? And the reason why these laws are not being laid down and codified is, I question whether there's a larger dynamic in play. Does India want to continue to be an investment destination and not have labor laws which are as strict and
as the West? So you're actually saying that corporations get away with a lot more here than they do in the West?
In the beginning of the discussion, it was said that women find it more difficult to actually say that they're being sexually harassed. I choose to believe that it is men because of certain stereotypes that attach to their gender. I think it is they who probably find it more difficult to come forward and say that we are being sexually harassed.
Do you know of any man who's been sexually harassed?
I wouldn't say that I know of any man, but I've definitely read about a study being done by the University of Minnesota where they said that yes, men are being harassed, just that they can't really come forward because their support base is not as much as the support base women have.
Okay, but I think we still all agree that it is the exception, that it does exist, but it is certainly the exception, that it doesn't compare with the institutionalized sexism that women have to grapple with.
I think I'll put up 2 points here. First is that the mutual consent thing which you're talking about. Mutual consent actually happens by force as well. In a lot of cases, mutual consent because the woman does not really have an option. She needs a promotion, or considering that whatever her options are, she has to go in for not saying that it's sexually harassed, but she has a mutual consent. Secondly, the definition of workplace is what I'm looking at, not really sexual harassment because that's really defined. Workplaces and the definition which the bill has, it really negates the idea of sexually harassment in the educational institutes. Delhi University, for that matter, there have been so many cases, but they don't fall into those guidelines just because workplace does not identify.
I think the draft bill has now been amended to include students as well. Am I right? It has been amended to include students. But to the larger point that I think has been thrown up, Prahlad, if I can start with you. This suggestion that has come up in some sections of our audience that the point is being made that mutual consent is a complicated phrase because a woman may feel it's the only way for her to get a promotion.
Especially in a country like India, where traditionally the women they've always had a glass ceiling, they've always had constrictions, they've always had to be 10 times better than men to even be equal.
But they don't necessarily have to sleep with the boss to get ahead.
They don't have to, but you see, there is so much pressure on them if they're ambitious, if they're independent, and if they're single, for instance. That, hell, what